if you were wondering who on earth Oliver Cromwell was, the chances are you learnt your history under the GCSE syllabus, which came in 1988. That's when facts became unfashionable and candidates were told to use their skills of empathy and imagination. Now, that might be useful training if you're planning a career in tabloid newspapers, but where does it leave the thousands of school children doing their exams about now? I've been looking at the history of exams and trying to find out whether standards really have changed.
The answer is it's certainly possible to say standards have dropped. I mean, politicians and others are saying it every day, but the short answer is are we first of all comparing like with like?
The advantages of O-level would unquestionably be the emphasis on historical knowledge and the requirement to harness the knowledge into a coherent argument. That was a very demanding academic skill, and it differentiated between the most able, the average, and the least able.
Well, to find out how the exams compare, Leviathan is setting its very own history test. And with us as candidates, we have Andrea Smith, who teaches at the Hampstead School, and Boris Johnson, who's a columnist for the Daily Telegraph. Boris, how long is it since you did an exam like this?
I did History O-level about 18 years ago.
Andrea, which history exams did you do?
I did O-level history, then went on to do A-level history, and later a degree in history.
If you're both ready, you may begin now. The candidates were given 1 hour, and the exam was in two halves, the first of which was an old-style O-level. Andrea and Boris went for choose 4 of these dates and say what events in history took place: 1066, 1588, 1832, 1914 and 1939. While they're hard at work under my strict invigilation doing their O-level, it's a chance for us to consider some of the most important questions about the history of exams.
Who thought up the idea of exams?
The trail for the guilty man leads us to China. 2,000 years ago, Emperor Han Wu-ti wanted to improve court administration. So he set written exams to find the most able candidates for the imperial civil service.
When did exams come to Britain?
In Britain, even as late as the 1770s, Oxford and Cambridge men weren't cramming their bewigged heads for exams. Most didn't have to do any. This left plenty of time for amusing themselves, and just sticking around was enough to earn a degree. But then the French started lopping off heads. The British authorities were worried that revolution might spread. Aspiring students from less wealthy backgrounds wanted a more meritocratic system, and that included written exams. Written tests spread quickly. By the mid-19th century, public schools were setting them for teenagers. State pupils had to wait until the 1870s, when annual tests were brought in. A school that did badly could be closed down or have teachers sacked.
What were history exams like before GCSEs?
The school certificate was brought in just after the First World War and was the main school exam for 30 years. Henry Mackintosh, later a teacher and examiner, took the certificate in 1947.
It was very much the culmination of your work, and you realised that you'd only really got 3 hours to deploy all that you'd learnt over the period of that time. And not surprisingly, it was fairly formal. It would be very much on the describe and discuss. Discuss the origins of the First World War, for example. So there was a strong emphasis upon writing. And there were really 2 forms. There were either short notes, which you... and I still remember the terms of the Treaty of Kutchuk-Karnagi as a result of writing a short note, where you actually had to get information in a very compact form. And then in an essay, you could deploy that information over a wide domain. And quite frankly, you could do a bit of flanelling and bluffing if you could write well.
In the 1950s, the school certificate gave way to GCEs, the O and A-level exams. O-levels were really for grammar schools until the CSE papers appeared in the 60s most school leavers just didn't have to worry their little heads about qualifications.
You're both 15, aren't you?
Yes, sir.
And both leaving at the end of this term?
Yes, sir.
And what are you going to do, Wendy?
Hairdressing.
Are you hairdressing?
Yes, sir.
Because you want something neat and tidy and something to do with your hands?
Yes, sir.
Well, you never were one for GCE courses, were you?
No, sir.
Never mind.
Your time is up. Could I ask you to stop writing? So, Andrea, what did you make of that traditional O-level paper?
That was quite a scramble to get to the end. It was a shock. The timing was a shock, I think, for me.
And the content of the paper?
The
Questions, rather.
The questions make great demands on sort of short-term memory.
Boris, how did you find the old-style O-level paper?
Well, it could have been worse. I found I was dredging up stuff from really a long way back, and I found myself curiously doing this exactly the same waffle that I used to do when I was in trouble in exams sort of 20 years ago.
OK, what you're going to do now is move on to part 2, which is based on a recent GCSE paper, and the emphasis is quite different. It's much more on source materials, which you'll find included as part of your exam scripts. You may begin. While the O-levels are being marked, Boris and Andrea tackled GCSE questions like, do the sources support the view that the American bombing campaign against the Vietnamese was successful?
Have school history exam standards fallen?
The most recent government survey on exams found no evidence of falling standards. Comparisons across the decades are clearly problematic, though, because in every era teachers have complained.
Well, I could produce you, in fact, examiners' reports from the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, which, apart from a slightly occasionally arcane expression, would be saying exactly the same thing as, in fact, the examiners of the 1980s and so on are saying.
Here, for example, they've been setting exams for 120 years, and examiners of yesteryear had plenty of criticisms. In 1955, they were concerned that the spelling of words like statute and Boer War was most erratic. And they worried about regrettable inaccuracies in dates in 1929. Another year they complained of a striking lack of originality in the papers. But more fundamental concerns were raised in 1988 when the new GCSE was brought in. To many teachers, it just wasn't enough of a test.
What actually happened on the paper was that children were given sources, gobbets of information, and the examination tended to be a comprehension exercise. So you didn't need to bring too much information with you to the exam, you simply answered the questions. And in addition to that, you had to use what were called skills of imagination or empathy. So you could imagine what the past might have been like, which was quite interesting but impossible to mark. I did some research which was published in one of the newspapers some years ago with 10 and 11-year-old children who knew very little history at all, and I gave them half of one of the GCSE papers, and the vast majority of these 10 and 11-year-olds passed it because it was simply a question of comprehension.
OK, your time is up. I must ask you to stop writing. So what did you make of the new-fangled GCSE paper then?
It was just more enjoyable to do. Your memory was stimulated by the sources there, so it brought back memories of the facts you'd learned, the knowledge that you have.
Because it was more enjoyable than the first old-fashioned test, I find it suspicious. And I suspect it was less of a proper test.
Andrea, do you think it's just as well that you have a paper that puts less emphasis on facts, since kids probably know a lot fewer?
I don't think that's the reason, Jing. I think the reason for not having an emphasis on pure facts is that the acquisition of facts is a relatively simple skill.
All a load of absolute rubbish. I mean, I take what you say, Andrea, about it being, you're getting more stimulation, but the objective of an exam is that you bring your knowledge to it. You're meant to know things.
But they're not only testing your knowledge here. Knowledge is deemed to be only one part of a GCSE exam. Your understanding is being tested here, your understanding of sources.
The fact is that a clever child coming to this will find this absolutely peasy.
Who does better at exams, girls or boys?
Well, girls took over from boys when GCSEs came in. The new emphasis on imagination or empathy suits them. The boys were better at old-style fact cramming.
Boris, let's start with you and the examiner's comments. On the first paper, that was the old O-level style paper, you did 1066 and 1914 as the great years that you were looking at. He did say that he would have given you an A for that first paper. Now, Andrea, you also went for the dates on the old-style ones. You didn't finish the whole paper. You only managed 3 of the 4 elements.
I've forgotten how to do these romp-through papers, basically.
With the modern paper, the current one, he thinks it's very much more impressive because obviously you've really got this knack of extracting the relevant from the irrelevant. Excellent paper, A+.
Good. I'm very pleased.
Well, Boris, on the modern paper, the GCSE type paper, this is fascinating. It says lacks the technique of extracting relevant detail from the source material.
Yes, well, that might be a legitimate criticism.
Worrying one for a journalist, isn't it?
Well, we don't normally... well, sure.
Nevertheless, despite the fact that he criticised you for that, he also awarded you an A for that paper too.
Terrific. Ripper. Bonza, can I go now, please?
You can, Boris, and so must